The envelope was sitting in the wrong place, and nobody seemed to care but her. Nora Whitfield noticed it the moment she came in from the kitchen corridor, carrying the second tray of champagne flutes. It was propped against the centerpiece on the main conference table, a long cream-colored envelope with a wax seal pressed into the back flap, leaning slightly to the left, like someone had placed it in a hurry. The other gift envelopes were arranged neatly on the side credenza near the window, where Nora herself had set them 2 hours earlier. She knew exactly how many there were and where each one sat. That was her job. She set the tray down on the side cart and looked at the envelope again. Then she looked around the room. The celebration for Clifford Vance's 40 years in corporate law was well underway. 63 guests filled the 42nd floor of the Hargrove building, most of them in suits that cost more than Nora's monthly rent. The Chicago skyline sat behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, like a painting nobody bothered to look at anymore. A string quartet had been playing near the east wall for the past hour, and the caterers from downstairs were moving through the crowd with quiet efficiency. Nora had been with Vance & Associates for 11 years. She had started as a file clerk at 31 and worked her way up to senior events coordinator, which mostly meant she was the person who remembered everything everyone else forgot. She knew which partners took their coffee black, which clients had nut allergies, which senior associates needed to be kept away from each other at firm events. She was invisible in the way that people who keep everything running are always invisible, and she had long since made her peace with that. Clifford Vance was across the room near the windows, holding a glass of sparkling water and laughing at something his old law school roommate was saying. He was 67 years old and looked it in a dignified way. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with a handshake that still made younger associates straighten up without knowing why. He had built the firm from a 2-person office in Wicker Park into one of the most respected corporate law practices in the Midwest. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of that. His partners insisted on it. Nora picked up the envelope from the table. The wax seal was deep red, pressed with what looked like a monogram she didn't recognize. The paper felt heavier than standard stationery. There was no name written on the front, which was strange. All the other envelopes had Clifford written in the sender's handwriting, or Mr. Vance, or sometimes just CV in the familiar shorthand of old colleagues. This one had nothing. She turned it over. Nothing on the back either, except the seal. Miss Whitfield. One of the junior associates appeared at her elbow, looking flustered. The florist is on the phone again about the invoice. They're saying the wire didn't go through. Tell them it did, and I'll send them the confirmation number in 10 minutes. Nora tucked the envelope under her arm. I'm handling something first. The associate disappeared. Nora stood at the edge of the room and looked at the envelope again, trying to figure out what was bothering her about it so much. It wasn't just that it was out of place. It was that she'd been at her station, near the entrance, for the first 2 hours of the event. She had watched every person who came through that door. She had collected every card, every wrapped gift, every envelope, and brought them to the credenza herself. She had not seen anyone bring this one in. She thought about the service entrance, the kitchen corridor, the freight elevator that opened onto the north side of the room, the one that the catering staff used and that technically required a key card to access. She thought about whether she should just put the envelope back on the table and make something out of nothing, and stop making something out of nothing. Then she thought about the way it was leaning. She walked toward the credenza and stood with her back to the room, examining the envelope more carefully. The paper was thick and cold, real cotton stock, probably custom. The seal wasn't quite centered, and there was something else. A faint smell that she couldn't identify. Something chemical underneath the more neutral smell of the paper. She might not have noticed it if she hadn't been holding it so close. Nora had a habit that her ex-husband had called paranoid and her mother had called a gift. She noticed things, she cataloged them. She held on to details that other people let go of because details, in her experience, were usually what mattered. She set the envelope down on the credenza and took out her phone. She searched envelope smell chemical and got nothing useful. She searched wax seal tampering and got a WikiHow article. She stood there for a moment, feeling slightly foolish, and then she put her phone away and picked the envelope back up and walked across the room toward Clifford Vance. Getting to him took a few minutes. He was surrounded, the way he always was at these things, by people who wanted 5 minutes of his time. She waited at the edge of the group until his longtime paralegal, a sharp-eyed woman named June, caught her eye and gave her a small nod. June had been with Clifford for 22 years and could read the room better than anyone. Nora, Clifford said, when the circle around him opened briefly. He said her name the way he said most things, directly, without preamble. Is there a problem? I'm not sure, she said. I found this envelope on the main table. I didn't see it come in, and it doesn't have a name on it. He looked at the envelope. Then he smiled, the easy smile of a man who wasn't expecting anything to be wrong on his own anniversary celebration. Probably someone from the catering company snuck a thank you note in. They do that sometimes. He reached for it. Nora held on for just a moment longer than was comfortable. Mr. Vance, I'd like to ask you to wait on opening it. The group around them had thinned slightly. A few people glanced over. Clifford looked at her with genuine curiosity, not annoyance, which was one of the things that had always made him different from the other senior partners. Wait, he said. Yes, sir. Just for a little while. She kept her voice low. I'd like to figure out how it got on the table. He studied her face for a moment. Clifford Vance had spent 4 decades reading people in conference rooms and across courtroom aisles. He was not a man who missed subtext. All right, he said quietly. He took the envelope from her hand and put it in his jacket pocket. Let's talk after the remarks. She nodded and stepped back. A moment later, the group closed around him again, and the conversation resumed as if nothing had happened. What happened next was that Nora did what she always did, which was work the problem quietly. She went back to the service entrance and examined the door. The key card reader had a small green light, active, functioning. She found the catering supervisor, a compact and efficient man named Bert who had worked a dozen events at this venue, and asked him directly whether any of his staff had placed anything on the main conference table in the last 90 minutes. Bert said no. He said it without hesitation and without being offended, which told her he was telling the truth. She checked the guest list against the sign-in sheet. All 63 guests were accounted for. Nobody had signed in who wasn't on the list. She stood in the hallway outside the main room and thought about who had a key card for the service entrance. Building security, the venue's permanent staff, the catering company, and the tenants of the building's upper floors, which included on the 41st floor, the offices of a litigation consulting firm called Strand Advisory Group. Strand had been in quiet conflict with Vance and Associates for almost 2 years. Nora knew this, not because anyone had told her, but because she had overheard enough phone calls and seen enough tense hallway conversations to understand the shape of the situation. Strand had poached 2 of the firm's senior associates. Vance and Associates had in turn won a client arbitration that had cost Strand a significant contract. These things had a way of compounding. She knew one other thing. The managing partner of Strand Advisory Group was a man named Kevin Alderman, and Kevin Alderman's assistant, a young woman who had transferred over from Vance and Associates 18 months ago, had been on the guest list tonight as a +1 of one of the junior partners. The young woman's name was Cassie Ford. Nora went back into the main room and found Cassie near the bar, laughing at something on her phone. She was 26, pretty in an effortful way, and had always been perfectly pleasant during her time at the firm. Nora had helped her navigate the office's filing system during her first month. They had eaten lunch together twice. Nora watched her for a moment from across the room. Cassie was standing alone now. The junior partner she'd come with was deep in conversation with someone near the windows. Cassie glanced toward the main table, just once, quickly, and then back to her phone. That was enough. Nora walked back toward the credenza and took a position where she could see both the room and the hallway door. She texted the building's security desk. She had the number from a previous event and asked whether anyone had accessed the 41st floor in the last 3 hours after standard business hours. It took 8 minutes to get a response. When it came, it said that one key card had been used on the 41st floor service entrance at 7:14 p.m. The card was registered to a Cassie Ford, listed as an employee of Strand Advisory Group. The event had started at 7 o'clock. Nora read the message twice. Then she looked across the room at Clifford Vance, who was beginning to make his way toward the small podium near the east wall for the formal remarks. One of his partners was handing him a glass of champagne to raise during the toast. She moved fast. She crossed the room in a straight line, not running but not slowing for anyone, and reached Clifford just as he was stepping up to the podium. "Mr. Vance," she said it quietly, close to his ear. "I need 2 minutes before the remarks, please." He looked at her. Something in her face made him step back from the podium. "Excuse me one moment," he said to the room, with the easy authority of a man who could pause a room without explanation. He and Nora stepped to the side, behind the standing screen near the east wall, where the quartet had stopped playing. She told him what she'd found. She told him about the service entrance, about Cassie Ford, about the key card access at 7:14. She told him she didn't know what was in the envelope, but that she believed it had been placed on that table by someone who came in through the building next door, and didn't want anyone to see them do it. Clifford listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change much, but his jaw tightened slightly, and his eyes went very still in the way they did when he was processing something serious. You're certain about the key card. I have the text from building security. I can show you. He looked at it. He handed her phone back. And you think Cassie Forda? I think she accessed Strand's office at 7:14, which means she had time to come down the service stairs to this floor before anyone would have noticed she wasn't in the room yet. Nora paused. I could be wrong. But you don't think you are? No, sir. I don't. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the screen, the guests were starting to murmur. The remarks were supposed to have begun. Someone coughed. The string quartet started softly again to fill the silence. The envelope, Clifford said. What do you think is in it? I don't know. But the paper has an unusual smell, and I couldn't account for how it arrived. That's enough for me to not want you touching it until someone else looks at it. He reached into his jacket pocket and looked at the envelope for a long moment. His name wasn't on it. Nobody's name was on it. Whatever was inside was meant to reach him through curiosity alone, because who doesn't open the one unmarked thing on the table at their own party? I'm going to call Alderman, he said. Right now. That might warn him. I know. His voice was very even. That's what I want. He took out his phone and stepped a few feet further away. Nora watched his face while he dialed. She watched the precise moment when the call connected, the slight shift in his posture, the way his expression moved from controlled to deliberately blank, which was Clifford Vance preparing for something. Kevin, he said. It's Clifford. I'm in the middle of my party. I'm calling because one of my staff found an envelope on my main table tonight that no one can account for. I thought you might know something about it. A pause. Because Cassie Ford's key card was used on your office's service entrance at 7:14 this evening, Kevin, and she's standing in my event space right now. Another pause, longer this time. I'm going to have the envelope examined, and then I'm going to know exactly what we're dealing with. I wanted to give you the courtesy of a call first. He hung up. He stood very still for a moment. He didn't deny it, Clifford said. What did he say? He said he didn't know what I was talking about. Clifford put his phone back in his pocket. In 11 years of practice, I've never heard Kevin Alderman's voice shake. Nora thought about what to say and decided nothing was the right answer. Clifford looked at the envelope one more time and then handed it to her. Keep this. Don't let anyone else touch it. I'm going to finish the remarks. I'm going to thank my guests. And then I'm going to have a very different kind of meeting with my partners tonight. He straightened his jacket, stepped back around the screen, and returned to the podium with the same easy authority he'd left it with, as if he'd only stepped away to take a phone call. A light laugh moved through the room. He raised the glass of champagne his partner handed him and began to speak about 4 decades of the law, about his colleagues, about the cases that had mattered and the ones that had taught him something he hadn't expected. Nora stood at the back of the room and held the envelope and listened. She didn't know yet what would be found when the envelope was finally opened. Not that night, but 3 days later in the presence of 2 of the firm's partners and a forensic consultant who had been brought in quietly. What they found was not a weapon. What they found was a document. What they found was a kucha, a letter written on Strand Advisory letterhead purporting to be Clifford Vance himself, acknowledging that he had improperly influenced the outcome of the client arbitration the previous year. The signature was a near-perfect forgery. The letter was designed to be opened in a room full of witnesses on the night of a celebration, where its contents might spread through the legal community before anyone had a chance to verify or suppress them. It was, the forensic consultant said, a sophisticated piece of work. The chemical smell Nora had noticed was from the coating used to age the paper artificially. Kevin Alderman resigned from Strand Advisory Group before the firm could pursue formal action, which most people took as an answer in itself. Cassie Ford's key card records were part of the documentation submitted to the State Bar Association. There were no criminal charges ultimately filed, but the professional consequences were significant and lasting. And anyone who followed Chicago's legal community understood what had happened. The firm sent Nora a bonus, a generous one, with a handwritten note from Clifford Vance that said, "Your instincts have always been an asset to this firm." I don't think I've said so clearly enough. She put the note in her desk drawer. What she thought about later was not the document or the forgery or the professional machinery that had ground forward after that night. She thought about the moment she'd first picked up the envelope, that feeling of something being wrong before she could name what it was. She had almost put it back. She had stood there at the credenza and told herself she was making something out of nothing, that she was the events coordinator and not a detective, that the right thing to do was finish the champagne service and sort out the florist invoice. She was glad she hadn't listened to that voice. She thought about what Clifford had said to her. The morning after the forensic results came back when he called her into his office and closed the door. He had looked at her across his desk, The same desk where he'd negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and he had said quietly that he owed her something he wasn't sure he could adequately repay. "You didn't have to say anything," he said. "Most people in your position would have convinced themselves it wasn't their business." "It was my event," Nora said. He shook his head slightly. It was more than that. She didn't argue with him. She had been invisible for a long time, and she was not in the habit of arguing when someone finally saw her clearly. What she knew, what she had always known, was that the details other people let go of had a way of becoming the things that mattered most. A name missing from an envelope, a smell that didn't belong, a woman glancing once at an empty table and then looking away too quickly. None of it was dramatic. None of it announced itself. It was just the quiet accumulation of things noticed, held, and finally spoken aloud at the right moment. That was the work. It had always been the work. And on the 42nd floor of the Hargrove building, on a Thursday evening in March, with 63 guests and a string quartet and a skyline that nobody looked at anymore, it turned out to be exactly enough.